Ms. Donald, I wanted to start with you, and just on the very decision today to cut the rate by another 25 basis points. It's the sixth cut. What are the conditions in the economy that allowed for the bank's governor to make that decision?
It's not complicated. The unemployment rate is rising. There's excess slack. The economy, while it is starting to look like it's doing a little bit better, inflation is back towards 2%. It's been sub 2% for 3 of the past 4 months, and they have all the data they need to justify easing back towards what they're going to call the neutral rate. So a rate that is not tightening anymore, but having more of a neutralizing impact in the economy. So they had all the ingredients they needed for a cut. That's why it was widely expected. And they're probably going to have ingredients for further cuts later in 2025. The question is, what are these tariffs going to look like? How big will they be? How fast will they impact the economy? And will the central bank have to cut more and faster than what they're currently probably planning for?
If we close our eyes for a second, Mr. Schenfeld, and imagine a world in which these tariffs are not applied, in the absence of that part of the calculation, what would you have expected as far as interest rates go over the medium to long term?
Well, I think we're still a little high. If you look at what the Bank of Canada is saying, they want the economy to do better. They want to get back closer to full employment, in effect. And they're counting on sectors like home building, for example, to contribute to that. But when I look at where 5-year mortgage rates are right now, yes, we had a quarter where home building did pick up, but condo construction could be slowing next year because we've done a poor job selling them this year, and we sell them before we build them. I think we're going to need a bit more interest rate relief. So the overnight rate now is at 3%. I wouldn't be surprised to see it go a little below 2.5%, maybe to 2.25%. That's in the absence of the tariff threat. And I'm with Francis on this. I think that while there's some concern about tariffs causing inflation, I think the bigger concern will be tariffs hammering growth, which would ultimately put further downward pressure on inflation and force some additional cuts. But even without that, I think there's still a little room to give Canadians some relief.
In that vein, the bank's governor, Ms. Donald, talked about the uncertainty that the prospect of these tariffs creates. Because as you point out, today we literally got new information that maybe they aren't coming on Saturday. Yesterday, we thought it could be 25% across the board on Saturday. We really don't know at this point. But the bank did forecast in a worst case scenario what it would mean for the economy, right? And in particular, talked about a contraction of GDP at the if there are 25% tariffs in the neighborhood of 2.5%. I think a lot of people at home are wondering, like, what does that mean for me? Am I going to lose my job? How slow will the economy be? Like, how much of a recession will we be in? Could you, I guess, in layman's terms, describe what you might anticipate if the worst case scenario came to bear?
Well, this is an unfair response to that, but it depends, and it depends on a range of factors. For example, which areas do we see tariffs applied on? Do we see retaliatory measures coming through from the Canadian government or provincial governments towards there? What secondary industries are impacted? So, for example, if an auto plant shuts down, then folks who lose their jobs there are not likely to go to the movie theater or out to a restaurant. How does the Bank of Canada respond? Do they cut rates, as Avery and I expect, in order to soften some of that blow? And what does the fiscal package from the government look like? So the Bank of Canada today really tried to show you an illustrative example of what all of these pieces could look like. But the end of the story is, no matter the magnitude or where they've applied, we know 2 things will probably be true, which is that the pressure on growth will be to the downside, and there'll probably be some element of job losses or concerns there, and yet inflation is likely to rise. That's not a great combination. It's very complicated for the Bank of Canada. Even if they were to hike rates to combat that type of inflation, it certainly wouldn't bring tariffs down. In fact, you'd probably exacerbate some of the downside risks on growth. So this isn't just about growth down, inflation up. We know what that recipe typically creates for the Bank of Canada. It's what this new type of inflation really means and the role of a central bank within it. And I don't think it's to hike up rates to make things more difficult for Canadians. It's probably to support them.
Yeah, Ms. Donald leads me to exactly the point that the clip that we played at the outset, Mr. Schenfeld, of the segment. It was the comment from the Bank of Canada's governor that stood out to me at least the most when he said monetary policy cannot offset the economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict. What does that mean?
Really what he's saying is that, yes, they could support economic growth, for example, by cutting interest rates, but it doesn't cure the fact that we reallocate labor in an unfavorable way. I mean, why economists actually like trade? It's very simple. The country does more of what it's good at, which is things that it exports, and less of what it's not so good at, which it then imports. And that's where the gains from trade come from. If you slow two-way trade, then we end up having to shift resources into things that we should be importing, and we do less of what we're really good at, which is exporting. So we can make the economy recover. We can use fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus to get back to full employment, but that mix of employment won't generate as much output as it would have if we were benefiting from the gains from trade. That's the message that I think Canada is trying to send to the US. And it's the message that virtually all card-carrying economists actually understand. The problem is that politics is interfering with economics at this point.
Well, that also leads me to another point that I wanted to ask you about, both about Ms. Donald. I'll start with you. And I actually have a clip of Trump's new commerce secretary, who's going through his confirmation hearing today, rebutting questions from senators asking about what the economic impact in the U.S. would be of tariffs, contending that it would raise prices. And he, like the president has done in previous instances, fought back against that characterization. Let's play the clip if we have it.
I can commit that the economy of the United States of America will be much, much better. A particular product's price may go up, but all of them, this is not inflationary. The two top countries with tariffs, India and China, have the most tariffs and no inflation. It is just a nonsense that tariffs cause inflation. It is nonsense.
So, Ms. Donald, I wanted to ask you, that is what they're putting out there. What are the facts as you see them?
Well, far from nonsense to imply that tariffs can create inflation. But let's just remember how inflation is calculated. You have a price increase. It happens once, and then a year later, it falls out of your year-over-year comparison. So often we refer to that as a one-off. But for most Americans or Canadians, that price level is permanent. So to reference that there are other countries that have high tariffs, but that the year-over-year hasn't increased, doesn't really make a lot of sense for me. Now, there is an argument that actually if we see a big currency adjustment, for example, the Canadian dollar were to weaken quite a bit and the US dollar were to strengthen, that could offset some of the so-called inflationary impact. But the US dollar has already strengthened very materially. And what we're witnessing and talking about for 2025 is fourfold increases in tariffs relative to what we saw in 2018, 2019. So we can't use the argument that in 2018 we didn't see material inflation. Therefore, if we quadruple the amount of tariffs coming through, well, there won't be an impact. The poison's in the dose in this case. So yeah, there could be offsetting elements for the United States, but this is certainly not a situation where we can be dismissive about the inflationary impacts for the American people or even for the Canadian people if we were to see retaliation on that side.
I've got 30 seconds left. The last word goes to you, Mr. Schenfeld.
Well, I think it is true that the inflation impacts for them aren't as big because the U.S. doesn't import as much as a country like Canada does. But for them, it's also the standard of living impact. So they, too, will find that they have to reallocate labor. They can't create more jobs because they're pretty close to full employment already. And if the U.S. Export sector slows, and it will if other countries are retaliating with tariffs, they're going to lose some jobs in some very productive sectors and forced, in fact, to produce some things that they're not as good at. So there's certainly a standard of living impact. And the example from Trump's first term, he put tariffs on Chinese-made washing machines, and U.S. producers also raised their prices because the Chinese washing machines were more expensive. And what the data show is actually the full impact of the tariff was borne by American consumers. So this is definitely a tax on U.S. consumers. And referencing where inflation happens to be in China and India, when they didn't actually raise their tariffs recently, as Francis pointed out, that's not really the way we look at it. We're looking at the year where you put on a higher tariff, do prices go up? And the evidence suggests, yes, they do.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Really appreciate both of you making time for the conversation and your analysis tonight. Francis Donald is the chief economist at RBC, and Avery Schenfeld is the chief economist at CIBC.